Hey, welcome to Modern Day Hysteria. Very excited to have you here as we have guests here tonight. We are going to have a very fun and interesting conversation. This is just kind of an open, free-for-all discussion in terms of bring up whatever you feel excited about or something that maybe you want to get different opinions on from a theist or an atheist. And very excited to mention here tonight, I'm just going to go right down the row from the list that I have here on my viewfinder. JMD Apologetics, glad to have you back. Would love to hear what you have been up to over at your channel. Just maybe share a little bit, 1 or 2 minutes on what you've been up to over there.
I've been working on a few series of videos. Right now I'm working on a big deconverted man response, if anyone in the chat or on the stream right now knows who he is. Then I'll be doing a response to scholar fiction. And I'm doing a few philosophy videos and then another logical fallacy video. So I just have a bunch going on right now.
Rad. Absolutely. Next, Christopher M. Hansen. Very excited to have you on as well. So Christopher, we want to share just a little bit about what's going on in your channel.
So hi, I run the Biblical History Skeptics YouTube channel, and on that right now, what we're doing is quite a mix of things. My friend Brian and I are leading an atheist Bible reading, and we're reading the Bible from beginning to end. I'm working on scripting a series where I go through scholarly views on the composition of each book of the Bible individually, working on the script for Job right now. And then I'm also trying to work on getting some interviews with different people as well.
Rad. Absolutely. So also, last but not least, we have Atheist Edge. Very glad to have you here. Thank you so much for coming on. And if you wanted to share what you've been up to at your channel.
Hey, James, thanks for having me on. Let's see. Over the weekend, we recorded 13 hours of footage. So that's going to be slowly trickling out as it gets edited. But we had Aaron Raw was here for like 10 of that 13 hours. So hats off to him. I mean, a channel like ours that has less than 5,000 subscribers, a name that big that's willing to give us that much of his time. It was just really awesome. And Saturday night, we did a live show with Dusty Smith, the Cult of Dusty, one of the original pioneers of atheist YouTube. And let's see, coming up in November 11th, we're recording with Richard Carrier right in the studio. On November 12th, we're doing a atheist and Christian book club. It's half atheists, half Christians. We're going to meet here in Dallas-Fort Worth and discuss his book, Why I'm Not a Christian. November 13th, he's doing we booked him for a talk, a book signing, and just an informal chat at a pub here in Fort Worth. So we'll have Richard Carrier for 3 days straight. And then we're taking the month of December off, and we're looking for some great interviews starting the new year out.
Absolutely. So I am very excited to talk about a variety of different issues. But before that, I want to quick mention everybody who is participating tonight. Their link is in the description below. Totally encourage you, check out their channel. It's convenient. It's down there already. Even if you don't agree with the people that are on tonight, then you can at least understand where they're coming from, though, by checking out their channel and listening to them. So also, we're going to jump into some of the more interesting issues that we're stoked to talk about tonight. I've got one that's just kind of been sitting in the oven warming up for a while. I want to know if you guys have any in particular, though, that maybe you think are especially exciting or that you want to get to right now. Now, one thing that I just want to mention that I appreciate is it seems that philosophers are willing to broach the sometimes controversial subjects. And more importantly, though, they're not all upset about it afterwards, even after disagreeing strongly. So I appreciate that you guys are like that. Not everybody's like that. And so feel free, even if it's controversial, even if you feel like you're pressing anybody in the group, I think we're all familiar with it. So any issues that everybody's excited about?
Well,
I'm open.
I know, same here.
Okay, then I'm going to crack this one open. I'm glad. So the evolutionary debunking arguments against the moral argument. are you familiar with these types of arguments? I'm sure you're familiar with the moral argument. We'll just say, think of the moral argument as put forward by William Lane Craig.
Yeah,
You guys are familiar with that?
That's what my mind instantly jumped to, was William Lane
I'm
Craig's
not a
argument.
philosopher. Is that something close to like divine command theory? Like it can't be moral unless it's prescribed?
William Lane Craig's variation is particularly, yes, divine command theory.
All right. It implies at the very least an omniscient intelligence. It may not be divine, but it's got to be. Well, it might not even be omniscient. It's just got to be super intelligent, right?
No. So the divine, William Lane Craig's theory, if I remember correctly, his objective moral argument for God went, if objective moral.
I know it on top of my head. If you want me to say it, just
if you want to do it, that's fine.
Yeah, it's
I know it off my head as well.
Oh, okay.
Too, so
okay, it's a monens ponens. If objective moral values and duties exist, then God exists. Objective moral values and duties do exist, therefore God exists. That's sort of how the argument goes. I would use a different argument if you've seen Inspiring Philosophies, moral series, defense of moral realism, and so on.
So we can definitely talk about, because I think that Inspiring Philosophy might have a good answer to this objection. The objection, are you familiar? If you're not familiar with Sharon Street's evolutionary debunking argument against morality in general, or namely our presumed perception of moral values in the world. Sharon Street's a philosopher, like top level philosopher. She's still alive today. And she's argued that, hey, so especially for the atheists, so for JMD and I, we don't believe in evolution as having occurred without God intervening in some way. So even if a Christian were to be, let's say, so for Christians, you could say there's maybe a different type of response they would give. But for the skeptic, let's say you're a skeptic and you're like, you know what? I currently believe that our moral experience may be explained by our evolutionary history. Namely, maybe the things that, we think feel like they have this moral value of moral goodness or wrongness. Well, the reason I feel that way is because the ones who didn't feel that way were less likely to cooperate and more likely to die out.
Well, that's precisely what I think. Yeah.
Yeah.
I actually slightly disagree. And here's why, is because I don't think that it actually quite has to do with the cooperation aspect. It has to do with the difference between mammals and other animals. For example, take reptiles. Reptiles do not actually have nearly as developed ethical structure as most mammal species do. The vast majority of mammals you'll find are usually very nurturing and also very societal in the way they interact. So they usually will have a small group or core that they stay with. Take wolves, or take chimpanzees or orangutans or other kinds of apes, or elephants is another really good one. And they all end up developing their own strict codes. Now, if you take reptiles, on the other hand, reptiles tend to be either a lot more lonesome or they set up a very territorial response to everything. And I don't think that it developed as a necessity of cooperation just to survive, just because they'd be less likely to. I think that the reason that it developed was because that they were automatically being drawn towards each other. And so in order to survive, they were developing a cooperation, not that it was a necessity and they could have survived on their own though. Bears, for example, bears are much more lonesome and on their own than other kinds of mammals.
Okay. So let's say like we grant like no problem, it could have been the case that organisms could have evolved differently. But if it were the case, like, would you deny actually that with human evolution, that a lot of the moral presumed experiences that we have, like, so for example, I sense, like, it seems to me that stealing would be wrong or that murdering would be wrong. And it seems to be true that if I was an organism who didn't have those perceptions, I would be more likely to do those things, right? So,
But your life expectancy would be way lower because society would take steps against you.
It depends on the society. Ultimately, as particularly with when you take humans, for example, there are Amazonian tribes that have no concept of, say, property, no concept of ownership. So
But then there would
the notion of stealing doesn't exist.
Right.
And that's what one way that you can look at it is because naturally their ethic codes did develop differently than other groups. And it's particularly true of tribal societies. Tribal societies generally don't have concepts like stealing and stuff like that. Basically, if you own, quote unquote, something, it's only for as long as you're basically holding it in your hand.
Super interesting. Okay, this is actually even more exciting, and for me, I'm even more interested because I've never had anybody take this position, but I actually appreciate that you've given something. So when you say some groups don't like the concept of stealing itself isn't even real to them, and so they would just maybe not care if someone stole from them, or it wouldn't even be stealing. They would just, if they had water and someone took it from them, they might just say, well, it wasn't mine to begin with, so how could I be mad at the guy? But wouldn't there be, I mean, that would be hard to do in terms of explaining away every single moral behavior, right? Because there are plenty of other ones that would be probably selected for, like, I'm sure those tribes like probably would think murder's wrong, right? Like if you murder somebody, it's a bad idea for your survival because the rest of the tribe's probably going to come back and punish you now, maybe by murdering you. So
it depends on, well, it also depends on the circumstance. And that's one, murder is a really, really fun one in particular, because it actually it always can depend on the circumstances of it. For example, in American society, if I kill someone because they're really starting to like threaten me, then generally I can be justified in doing that. If they're threatening me and I, shoot them in self-defense, that's okay. Now, or if I see them hurting someone else, that's okay. Then there's also, Texas used to actually have a law where if you found a man sleeping with your wife, you could kill him. I'm not kidding. That used to actually be on the books.
Yeah, I live in Texas. I can confirm that. It's the the crime of passion, but the murder, not murder, but the weapon has to already be in your hand. It has to be an instant reaction. No malice of forethought. You can't like go into another room and pick up and come back.
Right. But still, it still makes that exception. That's why murder is a very particular one that's really interesting, because in our different societies, we actually build up quite a few exceptions around it. Mayan society, for example, was very messed up the way they treated it. Aztecs didn't even consider it murder per se if you were killing a slave to sacrifice to a different deity. Another really good one that I like bringing up. So when the Bible talks about like the Canaanites and how they'd sacrifice children to their gods and stuff like that, there's not a whole lot of evidence that mainland Canaanites did that. There's a little bit around Jerusalem and stuff. It's why the Valley of Hinnom was so reviled by the community. But the one that we have a lot of evidence for is Carthage. And Carthage prescribed infant sacrifice to their two head deities. So it is very dependent on the society if murder's okay, because if you're trying to, speak to your deities and procure and make sure you get a good season of crops and stuff like that, killing your infant and burning it alive for your god is sometimes permissible.
So I want to jump in here real quick. So it sounds like you're a moral subjectivist. You can correct me if I'm wrong. Are you?
Moral nihilist.
Okay, so even more down that road. So since you basically believe that moralities depend on society, You said it was messed up for the Mayans, so would that just be your own?
It's my personal opinion.
Okay. But
my with moral nihilism, I want to clear this up because a lot of people get confused when I say it because they're like, "Oh, nihilist," go a whole different route. What moral nihilism is basically that there is no such thing as an intrinsic right or wrong that we are able, that I can perceive, and that all moral codes in the end are just developed by people, and they're ultimately probably meaningless.
Sometimes I like to play a little thought experiment, have a conversation about morality, but agree ahead of time that the following 6 words will not be spoken: right, wrong, good and evil, should and ought. So those 6 words are stricken from our vocabulary. And now let's talk about morality, and it can go for some fun directions.
Oh yeah.
Should we ought to talk about it that way?
Well, I'm not saying we do it now. It's really, it goes down some crazy paths, though.
Huh.
Well, would we even be talking about morality at this point? Because
yeah, exactly. I mean, but it shows that how many times tonight am I going to say I'm not a philosopher? Here's twice, but it really just seems like it's back to James's point, the evolutionary aspect of it. Murder is an unlawful killing. So if someone that didn't have that intrinsic, whatever we call that desire to not murder people, someone lacked that, he goes off and does it. Society has already established that law, whether it be arbitrary, whether it be subjective. Society has established it, whether it's divinely commanded, and he's likely to pay a very heavy penalty for that, probably his life. And if he is not yet of childbearing age or has not produced offspring, well, if it is inherent, genetic, that was just that whole bloodline just got cut off. So there is an evolutionary component, maybe.
Possibly. I don't think it's likely that case. So people who usually lack the ability, people who usually think that killing another person automatically is just okay, or don't think that there is anything wrong with it. I mean, they generally fall into one of 2 categories, either a sociopath or a psychopath. Either condition, they're mentally unstable.
And psychopathy is genetic, yes?
It depends. Actually, psychopathy can have multiple different causes.
Oh, right. Traumatic brain injury can cause
right.
it.
Exactly. Yeah. So that's why I said it's not necessarily a genetic thing. Sociopathy, to my knowledge, is not genetic at all that we've discovered. And then there's numerous other brain conditions. Schizophrenia. I mean, schizophrenia, when you get it, I mean, at that point, you're at the mercy of the way that your brain decides to start interpreting reality.
We're in James's territory now. You are a post-grad in psychology, correct?
That's right. Yeah. So,
yeah. Are we saying anything that strikes you as not quite right?
No, this all sounds good with what I know of the literature. It's definitely so. Like, I'm more like industrial, organizational psychology, like motivation and stuff. But I've taken classes in like psychopathology, and it all sounds legit. And I think that, okay, so I'm impressed at and excited about the fact that that Chris is digging his heels in, and he's trying to take and actually giving a defense, one that's I'm kind of like, oh, I've never heard it like that before. Now, I don't know if it's the case that, so I think that Atheist Edge pointed out one important consideration, which is that there's a difference in those societies, even the ones like, let's say we look at the ancient Near East, and we saw Chris mentioned some of the tribes that in some cases the Canaanites were going to war with, were burning their children alive as sacrifices to Molech or other gods in order to please those gods, to try to get things like, rain, whatever. My guess though is they nonetheless distinguish between sacrifices versus murders within those cultures. Like, my guess is that you still couldn't run around and just axe anybody and say, oh, well, it was a sacrifice. My guess is that you would have some people in those societies though that would still say, nope, like that wasn't like the ceremonial kind of sacrifice. So I just don't know if I can maybe concede that like there's some cultures out there, though very few, that wouldn't have the concept of stealing, but murder is a hard one to bite on, Chris.
Well,
like,
that's why I said it depended on how you define murder and what constitutes murder. So, for instance, when we're talking about a Canaanite society, would you accept the fact that the language is Hebrew, Phoenician, Edomite, Aramaic, all those are all related, right?
Sure.
Well, Edomite, Moabite, Phoenician, Ammonite, and Hebrew are all Canaanite languages. They're all Canaanite people. So within the Canaanite groups, you have the Israelites, who would say child sacrifice is the most abhorrent thing on earth. And then on the other side, you would have Carthage, which was a huge city, Phoenician and Punic speakers, so other Canaanites, and they were sitting there burning their infants to their gods Baal Hamon, if I remember, and another god, if I can't remember the name.
Marduk, Moloch, El.
Not Marduk or El. They didn't consider El or Marduk was not even is not a Canaanite deity. That belongs to the another Semitic group, particularly Babylon.
Don't all Hebrews have origins in Canaanite?
No.
Isn't that the origin of them? Wasn't El, who is now Yahweh, he was part of the Canaanite pantheon? Yes.
No.
With Asherah and.
Okay, so you are right that the Hebrews are from Canaanite religion, but the Babylonians, who are another Semitic group, are not. The Babylonians are a Semitic group, but they are not of the Canaanite descent. They're of a different clade of Semitic languages and groups. And the Babylonians in particular ended up really merging with the Sumerian religion in particular. They still had their rough approximates of the Canaanite deities. What we actually should define them as is proto-Semitic deities, because all the Semitic groups probably had an original core religion or core set of deities, and then it spread out from and then in the case of Babylon, they completely really just took on the Sumerian religion, and Marduk is not attested in any of the other Semitic religions of the area. The thing with Yahweh also is Yahweh's not a Canaanite deity. He's not a Semitic deity at all. We don't know where Yahweh came from.
I thought he was the original El.
No.
And his brother was Moloch, and his sister was Asherah, or no?
No. So El and his consort Asherah are basically the two head gods of the Canaanite pantheon. There may be a few other consorts, but they're not particularly important. It's mostly El and Asherah, who are top tier. Below that, then they have their children like Baal, Dagon, and a few others. Actually, they have, if I remember correctly, a total of 72 children, and they rule over the 72 nations of the world in Canaanite mythology. And that is actually somewhat reflected in the Bible. The notion of that is hinted at in Deuteronomy 32, 8-9, and also in the Table of Nations in Genesis. But then below that, then you have another tier of like messenger deities and craftsman deities and stuff like that.
So every instance of the word of the proper name El in the Bible is not a reference to Yahweh?
It is, but what happened was that after Yahweh, Yahweh's not a Semitic deity, so there's no real consensus right now. One of the ones that has the most basically the most supporters is called the Kenite hypothesis, which posits that Yahweh probably began around Edom or Midian, and is based off of an Egyptian inscription that basically reads Land of Shazu and then the letters YHW. We don't know. It's 3 letters out of the Tetragrammaton. It's from the 13th century. If it is referring to Yahweh, it's the oldest inscription and mention of Yahweh in any ancient literature that we have. That would make Yahweh either an Edomite or a Midianite deity. The problem we have there is that of all the Edomite inscriptions and writings that we have left, and it's not many, our corpus for Edomite is exceedingly small. But from what we have left, we have no mention of Yahweh in any of it. And we have nothing surviving of any Midianite writing, if they had any. And then, but what we do have is pottery. And the Midianite pottery that we have actually is very similar to Aegean pottery. So that would actually posit that Yahweh may have been an Aegean deity at first.
Well, this was a tangent, but that's some interesting stuff.
Yeah, I wanted to correct that. Basically, then what happened is that Yahweh ended up then being brought into Israel sometime probably around the 10th or 9th century BC. And then he did get merged with El and took syncretized. And that's how he ended up getting the epithets El and everything like that. And then he also, James S. Anderson just published, he's a relatively newer scholar. I think he just got his PhD in 2010, but he published his dissertation, and he actually made a pretty convincing argument for Yahweh also having some syncretism with Baal as well.
Super interesting. We can come back to that. I just want to quick introduce and welcome Mr. Brass to the conversation. Mr. Brass, glad to have you. Thanks for your patience, as I know that it's been a busy day for you. So we just want to quick say, Mr. Brass, would you like to share about your channel, what you're doing over there, give a quick introduction, and then we can kind of jump back into conversation?
Sure. Yeah, I'm Mr. Brass. I'm a deist YouTuber. On my channel, I really do a lot of things. I typically, I focus on a couple philosophical arguments, and after about every other 10 videos, I do a big project where I work on like something about history or culture. I'm currently now working on like a mythology project where I work on where I'm talking about like different mythologies and of different cultures, like the Egyptians, the Greeks, and so on.
Rad. Excellent. Thank you very much. We're glad to have you here. And one thing that we can come back to, like Old Testament, or I should say pre-Old Testament discussions, but one thing that I'm excited about, Mr. Brass, I got to get your opinion on this, because I have to say Chris has done a pretty good job of giving a defense of his. So basically we had started with the moral argument, and then I brought up Sharon Street's evolutionary debunking argument saying, hey, if we've evolved to have these perceptions of morality the way they are simply as a result of that way we could survive better, then we should think of those perceptions as being explained by our evolutionary history rather than that we're actually picking up on anything out there in the universe that's, you know, in other words, objective moral values. And so it's a way of basically saying we should doubt our moral experiences of the world. And Chris has given a good argument where Christopher has basically argued that, hey, we, in actuality, we may not have evolved in such a way as to have kind of converged on these similar moral perceptions of the world, because all these different societies have different moral codes. And that's one reason to doubt it, is to say, we don't know that humans actually have all converged on this similar moral code, because we do differ so much, morally speaking. Is that fair, Chris?
Yes.
Roughly?
Yeah. One thing I also have always equated moral values to as well is I also like to equate it to a sense of taste. For example, so I think it'd be fair to say that a couple of us have probably come to different conclusions on morality than we used to have, and that our views on certain things have probably changed. Like I used to be a death penalty advocate and stuff like that. I'm not anymore. I don't want to speak on behalf of anyone else. If you guys remain solid, I mean, that's pretty awesome. But since
yeah.
that's,
I mean, like, yeah. Well, I mean, I'm personally not a death penalty advocate, although it has really nothing to do with the morals of it. It has more or less to do with the economics of it.
Mm-hmm.
I find it's much cheaper to just leave them rotting in a prison cell than it is to actually put them in on death row. So I can completely abandon the morals of it and just say, it's not really expensive. And besides, you could also make the argument that being stuck in a prison cell for decades at a time is a much worse punishment than actually being killed.
Yeah. That is debatable because if being stuck in a prison, I mean, you're still alive. So there's still the possibility of actually doing something more, even if it's really boring or terrible. So that depends on your point of view there. Well,
I mean, it's like there's this old phrase like, there are worser fates than death.
I'm not sure there are.
Yeah, I mean, I would say being tortured would probably be one of them.
Essentially, I'm someone that's lived through quite a lot of excruciating pain right now.
Fair
actually,
enough.
I live off painkillers, so but anyways, besides that, my point of what I was trying to get to is that we've at least in my case, and I know in the case of other people that I know, is that we have changed our moral opinions over time. And also, what's really interesting is that a lot of our moral opinions seem to be kind of like our taste in food. We don't like some foods, we instantly don't like for a long time. And we don't like them sometimes never within our life, but sometimes after repeated exposure, or we repeatedly hear how good it is or whatever, we change our minds. Or we just find that one day it starts, tasting good. So the same way as that sometimes we find that a moral argument for something or against something suddenly starts making sense or sounds good. That's where I liken it to, because I don't see that there's any basis really in the end for all of our moral values, even with them all differing, to be rooted actually in evolution. I think that a lot of it actually does come down to personal choice. I just think that personal choice is usually just heavily influenced by the society we grow up in.
Really interesting. I don't want to talk too much.
Well, so if I may give my own perspective on it as well, if I
could just quick introduce Praise. Sorry. So we'll come right back to you, Mr. Brass, but we had one new person jump in. So Praise, I am glad that you are here. To be honest, I'm not exactly sure who you are because I had sent the link out to several people who said they might come. So Praise.
I gave them the link.
Oh, okay, cool. Yeah, Praise, if you want to share about your channel, we would love to hear it.
Yeah, I'm just with partner JD. I'm a Christian, so I have like a Christian moral framework. So that's it. Yeah.
Rad. Awesome. So, okay, Mr. Brass, sorry about that. Just wanted to get to introduce you. Thanks for coming, Praise. Glad you're here.
Thank you for your inviting me in. So
yeah, absolutely.
Well, yeah, I just want to touch upon that. It's like, yeah, you're right. It is influenced a lot. Like, there are certain things that we take for granted that we really didn't have. Like, for one, we tend to find it like this whole idea of sanctity of life is just like this intuitive thing. It just comes at us. But if you actually look at the history, in ancient times, sanctity of life was really not that much known. Like it wasn't like living was generally considered a good thing back then, but the thing is that they didn't put as much of a value on it. Like, if you were basically a man back then, if you were like, let's say you were a Spartan and you lived in Sparta, basically you lived to die, like in a war situation, because that was basically your situation. They considered death to be the honorable thing if you to die on a battlefield. And they often committed infanticide in order to push it. So they didn't like the whole, we tend to take it as self-evident that even something as basic as life has sanctity is, rooted basically in cultures.
So I sort of want to counter, not so much counter, but sort of add on to. Now I don't know the Spartans' belief. I believe that's Greece on the soul, but I know Socrates and many of the Greeks who followed his philosophy and so on. They saw they had an immortal soul, and that's why Socrates wasn't really afraid of dying in the last days of Socrates. He argued for his immortality of the soul. So in their view,
well, I do.
Okay.
If I could, I do want to disagree there. Actually, the big reason that Plato gives in the last days of Socrates for him just going calmly to his death was actually because he didn't want to commit a crime. He knew he was innocent.
Yeah,
but if he tried
to
to escape, then he would have been a criminal. So it was logical to him to just die and accept his death.
Well, I'm also adding with that in the soul and so on, but that is also correct. But my point being that to some of them, that death is sort of a honorable thing because then they go to the afterlife and so on.
Like with Socrates even played around with it where he said, well, if there is an afterlife, I'll be happier. I'll meet all the heroes of like the Iliad or whatever.
Yeah.
And if there isn't an afterlife, well, I'll be in a much better place than I currently am now, i.e. nowhere. So he was more of like a pragmatist. He felt like he had nothing to lose either way.
Right. Well,
I know he does.
And there's also the issue is when you talk about Greek afterlife in particular, Greek afterlife for the most part, unless you were one of the top guys, the top rung who got to serve in Hades' garden and work under Hades specifically, was basically like biblical Sheol, wherein you just go straight down to the grave and it's a dreary existence where you basically have no personality whatsoever. And it's where everyone, good and bad, goes. That's what Greek
so basically
Hades was.
American politics.
Ooh, spicy.
Mr. Brass, are you from America or are you a Canadian?
Oh, I'm American.
Okay, that's good. I guess it's true. So basically, so this is really good. But am I? Forgive me if I'm like obsessing over this. Maybe I'm beating a dead horse, but I want to see if Mr. Brass, you have a response to Chris over the idea that evolution can't actually explain our moral perceptions. And the one thing that I have to say, but first I want to hear Mr. Brass if you have anything.
Yeah, like evolution would at the very best tell us, how we came to have our moral values. Like, obviously I could say, we generally find suicide to be a bad thing because obviously, like, somewhere down in evolution, we kind of reasoned that, suicide isn't the best way of carrying on our genes. So overall, suicide and other behaviors like that have become taboo. But there's like nothing inherently wrong about it. Like, it just happens to be how it works out. I find like often a lot of times when we go, like, this is some of the problem I get with Sam Harris and his arguments, where you basically get stuck like in a natural what they call the is-ought fallacy, where you're trying to derive an ought from an is. And like with old Sam Harris's purpose, like he boils it really down to like I like to say it's scientific utilitarianism, where it's basically like the best for human beings or whatever contributes to the flourishing of human beings. I just find like we don't really in science, like I would say we I would say all the best at evolution would just tell us is how it came to be, and like not what we ought to do with it, because evolution is descriptive, not prescriptive.
Okay, so definitely we're focusing on like descriptive, and so for the, what's the word I'm looking for? So if it does explain it in a descriptive sense of like, hey, evolution explains why we have these perceptions of suicide being bad, and maybe murder, this is one we're still debating, but maybe murder being bad, and as a result, if you don't do those things, you're more likely to pass on your genes relative to those who do those things because they don't have a sense that it's bad. Like Chris, one thing I'll say is, I'll give you like the standard reply to moral relativists, which is that even if I say, okay, sure, people in these different societies, let's say they didn't even, let's say they like regularly sacrifice people all the time. I think that, again, I think we still have to talk about whether or not that's murder, because for them, it's like they might still distinguish that from murder and still believe there's such a thing as murder. But if we go higher level and we say, well, they sacrifice their family members because they value the principle of loving their community. Well, in that case, we would say, oh, okay, well, then all societies at least agree that like loving or doing what's best for your community is what's morally, right. So like on a higher level, they all do actually have agreement. It's just that you could say it manifests on the lower level in different ways, some of which they do sacrifices of humans, and some of which, maybe they do something totally different than that. But do you get at what I'm saying? That on a higher level, both of them would explain those behaviors, whether they sacrifice people from their own group or not, as being as a result of the fact that they say, oh, I think this is for the best interest of my group.
I would actually disagree. And here's why. Let's jump to medieval France. Medieval France run by a bunch of tyrant rulers who were in no way acting for the good of their society. But they were the ones prescribing law and what was not acceptable. So how do we judge what? So in their society, let's take Louis XIV. Taxed his civilians into the ground, led huge famines. Also, he could get just tons of gold. They still have like a bunch of what he did, like a gold gate to his palace and a bunch of other stuff like that. And all at the expense of his society and its suffering. And yet, society did not overthrow him, that I remember. I believe because that wasn't the French Revolution yet. 14th. I just want to fact check that real quick, but if I remember correctly, he did.
I'm going to quick introduce a new person while you do fact check it. We'll come right back to you. So, Jack, glad to have you on. Thanks so much for joining up, and we would love for you to share. Oh, go ahead. Sorry.
No, I just said thank you.
You bet. You're very welcome. We'd love for you to share about what's going on over at your channel, and then I will throw the description I will throw the link in the description below. So if you want to share your channel name as well as what you're doing over at your channel, we would love to have you do that.
Well, I don't really host any content on my channel, but I do a lot of debates on philosophy of religion on YouTube. So if you search my name, you'll find a lot of debates that I've done.
You bet. Rad. Well, we're glad to have you here. You've come to the right place. A fun debate tonight. So, Chris, I want to come right back to you, buddy. What do you got?
Okay, so yeah, I was correct. Louis XIV was not overthrown, ruled until his death. He had some failing health. So yeah, completely trashed the good and the welfare of his society, was dictating what was right and wrong. But I'm pretty sure that a lot of people would around him have said he was wrong. I'm sure we would say he was wrong now and by today's standards, but it wasn't wrong for him And he did, and the nobles that were running society and the people that were acting for the society and keeping it running didn't think it was wrong. Obviously not enough to do anything about.
So if I are you saying that it was like a society of like moral skeptics, like they just didn't believe anything was right or wrong, or?
Well, no, they believed it was acceptable for the king to act the way he was, despite the fact that it was for it was damaging society. So the point being is that not every time, it's not always that society is going to say that we should always act for the betterment of society. Lots of times they're just going to do things that they have no idea what the repercussions are, or they're just going to stick behind their rulers, even if it is for the worst, even if it leads to a worst possible conclusion.
Gotcha. Okay, I think I get what you're saying. My only thought is, it seems plausible you could have sociopaths get in power who aren't generalizable to the rest of the population in terms of their moral views. Like, in other words, that seems fairly easily explainable in that it's hard to believe that the majority of society would have agreed with him. So even though I would grant, like, sure, the few people that had power and could pull the levers to do things that significantly damage their own people group, like I would grant that happens. But my guess is that in that case, the majority of people would have had the perception of that as having been morally bad or something that some people ought not do, right?
I'm not sure that would be the case, though, because that is basically the history of monarchy. And people just, until it gets bad enough to cause a French Revolution, they just let the kings and people. I was more arguing from the standpoint that the civilians thought that it was acceptable for the king to act that way. At least they thought it was acceptable enough that they weren't going over and causing a revolt to behead him, like they ended up doing with his later successors.
Yeah, so I think that's an interesting point. I think that if there were good evidence that they were kind of like, nah, like we get pushed around, we get treated badly, but we don't really think it's wrong. I think that if you had some case, like let's say, I'd be pretty convinced if you said, well, maybe they believe that some sort of God or religion was telling them that, like, hey, this person's in charge, and so we just have to go along with it, even if they're treating us terribly.
Well, they definitely thought that.
That's more persuasive to me.
They definitely thought that. That's why France ended up completely removing all authority of the church, and why churches in France today can't even marry people.
Very interesting. Yeah, that I think is more persuasive in that you could say, well,
religion usually follows with a lot of the times politicians will just end up using religion ultimately as a tool to vindicate their rights. For example, I mean, the monarchs of England to this day are still crowned as the chosen divine ruler of God. They're crowned in the name of the Father, the Son, and the Holy Spirit. The Holy Roman emperors were all crowned as God's ordained servant. And then we could also look at other head religious figures like the Pope, who is the vicar of Christ.
This is super interesting. Okay, so I love the idea that, obviously religion has been a powerful force throughout human history. And some might argue that maybe, we don't want to say all religions, so we're not going to force ourselves to defend something that would be so difficult to defend. We could just say a lot of religions, though, may have been ones that their guidance or suggested ethics wouldn't actually be for the good of the majority of people in that community or society. Like, that's something I'm like, yeah, sure, and like wouldn't surprise me. I don't know if I would say it's a general rule that religions are that bad. I mean, because here's the thing, we have to there is good empirical data that like religious priming does bring about greater pro-social behaviors. And that seems to align pretty well with the idea that like religion kind of seems actually to be parallel with societies that, you know, people who care about their society, like being well off. So
James, would that include us also? Because I noticed in your advertisement for this show, you included a few hashtags, and one of which was atheism is a religion. So would we fall into that as well?
Well, that's a good question. So do you mean like, does atheism have the problem of, oh, wait, hold on. Okay, so
no, are we parallel to looking out for the good of society inherently? Because in your mind, we are a religion as well.
Well, I think it depends on, let's see.
Either that or we're not a religion, or you're using the secondary definition, which I wrote it down. It's the pursuit or interest to which someone ascribes supreme importance. So that may or may not include supernatural phenomenon, a divine creator, deities.
Yeah,
so I don't know what you meant when you hashtagged that.
Yeah, this is a great question. That's excellent. So what I could say the empirical evidence suggests is that religious primes do seem to bring about good behavior. Whether or not the researchers, I can tell you, like, because I'm familiar with, like, I've seen some of the primes that they've used, like the materials. They don't use like atheist primes because, I mean, depending on what your definition is, it's hard to do that. But they also probably wouldn't lump it in with religion. Now, there are, though, like secular symbols that we have seen can prime atheists to behave better, that kind of play the role of religion. So, for example, like if you have a bunch of atheists as participants, let's say you have 30 participants come in as your study subjects, and you prime them with pictures of like Lady Justice. So, you know, she's holding like the scale in one hand and the sword in the other, and she's blindfolded, and, you know, Justice is blind. Like these symbols of like moral or government type justice, you do see that it actually does improve the behavior. Like atheists will actually, after being primed with that, behave in a more pro-social way.
You're saying is that unique to atheists, or would the same occur if you got 25 or 30 theists?
Yeah, that's a great question. I think they might find it with theists too. I mean, my guess is that you maybe wouldn't find the effect as strong because theists maybe don't see like the government as, to the same degree, they don't see the government as a, what's the word I'm looking for? Like a that which morality.
Yeah.
Coming ahead.
Like a source document that it doesn't there's something else, another law that supersedes it.
Right,
so
exactly.
It's not as important.
Well said. Exactly. Yeah. So it's really interesting that, I mean, this is, you know, I've talked to Shannon Q about this before in terms of like, are there things that for atheists, in this case, morally speaking, and her and Shannon and I have talked about like happiness wise. So, you know, we do see that there is some empirical data, not just correlational, but experimental, that religious primes can make people happier, or at least relieve anxiety. And Shannon Q has said, well, hey, we also have those as atheists, though, right? I mean, atheists can meditate, and meditation is like a really strong treatment for depression or anxiety, and it does help.
You guys live longer, and we have a higher rate of suicide, though.
So
I also, well, to be quite fair, like, I always make sure to preference that, like, with places like Japan. Japan has a notoriously bad government when it comes to statistics because, like, they have a policy where they want to maintain a low crime rate. So what they'll tend to do is they'll take any murder, like that's not immediately, like, where they don't have the suspects ready for them. And they feel like it'll take too much work, they'll declare it as suicide.
Good point.
So, you know, with places like Japan, like, it's very common for them to just have, like, that's why when people say that the suicide rate in Japan is so high, you also have to preference that that's probably because the government there just list a lot of actual murders as suicides just to avoid having to make it seem like they have a bigger crime rate.
Yeah. Now, I want to say, like, with James, I actually completely agree with you that yes, religious crimes and religion in general seems to a lot of the time, not all the time, but a lot of the time can be used to help invigorate at what we would call a good moral standing or moral cohesiveness in a community. Can definitely promote happiness, most certainly. It can, but I think we do need to be careful because it can also promote the exact opposite as well. Very easily, we could easily see the abuse of religion worldwide and the negatives that that has on people. For example, we could look at ultra conservative fundamentalism and a lot of the families that are raised with that. I've known of several, and their kids grow up completely depressed with a lot of issues. I mean, I wasn't raised conservatively at all, and I still suffer from depression as a result of a lot of stuff that I ended up witnessing in my church and stuff like that. We do have to be careful that we don't just toss out the fact that it can also very much be used in the negative, because it is. I mean, historically as well, if we just want to look at the way that it was used as a justification for the Trail of Tears, used as a justification for slavery, for the Crusades. And then on the converse side, we have Islam doing the same thing. We have Buddhist terrorism. We have basically, if there's a religion you can think of, it has been used negatively in some
terrorism.
way. So,
yeah, I mean, what I always do make sure to preference is that it's very hard. Like, we sort of live in a luxury where we can distinguish between religion and government really pretty easily. But I like to mention that back in, like, let's say back in the Crusades, there wasn't that much of a distinction. It's sort of like how, for the Aztecs, for example, their government leaders were the people that ripped out the hearts of other people and ate the parts. So their religion was very much a part of their society. So, like, it's easy for us now to just sit and say, oh, this is a religion and this is not. Well, back really, like, when we get into the ancient times, it's really hard to assess. Like, any historian will really just say, well, we need to go on a metric, because what we tend to find out is, like, even a lot of the most obvious, like the Crusades, they do tend to have some, like, let's say, common elements that we find in every war. Like,
well, yeah.
You know.
Oh, yeah, they definitely do. But you also have the fact that the Pope was actively pushing.
Oh, yeah. I completely agree. Like, I'm not denying that the religion played a part in it. I'm just saying, like, for example, you could make the good argument that a lot of the crusade was, like, mainly about, like, for one, fighting off Muslims that were invading. They were growing in power.
Yeah, partially a response, but I mean, there's also the whole war over the Holy Land.
Oh yeah, I agree. Like, what I always find funny is, like, when you actually look at, I actually did a series on this on my channel about the Crusades. What I actually found funny is that when you actually look at it, Muslims really didn't take that much of a hard like, they considered Jerusalem and stuff sacred, but they didn't consider it a big economic hotspot. So if you actually look, what's so funny about it is, like, we hear about the Crusades so much, but really the Muslims, they didn't really even know much about the Crusades until like 100 years ago. And that was only because Protestants they were very bitter anti-Catholics who had read Voltaire and Edward Gibbons, had came up to them later on, like, because here's the thing, they mostly didn't really even think about the word, because to Christians, the Crusades meant everything. It was defending their land, and it was also religious as well. To the Muslims, they were more concerned about fighting off each other for their own orthodoxy.
Not to mention,
in fact, that's actually how most of the time Christians actually won Crusades is because they merely took advantage of Muslims battling amongst each other.
Except the Christians only won 2 of the Crusades. There were 13.
Yeah, I know, and it's like, I know.
That's another reason why the Muslims didn't care about it, was because the Muslims kept winning.
Well, yeah, and that is like, it was also Jerusalem. While it was sacred, it was also like not like an economic hotspot. Like, at some points, like there was, I believe, even one point where they offered it because just to give it to them. But they just didn't really care much about the land, not as much as Christians did. So there was differing values. A big part of the reason why you could say Christians lost a lot of it is because they were the traveling force. They were the ones that had to travel there, while Muslims were fighting on their own home turfs.
Well, Islam is at their height. They spread all the way up to Salzburg, Austria, and there was that was what did Chris say? Just 2 out of the 13, but those 2 pushed them all the way from Austria back to Jerusalem.
Not really, no. Actually, no. The Ottoman Empire lasted and was controlling all the way up all through Anatolia and Turkey. I mean, they were bordering Austria until the early 1900s.
Wouldn't Israel be completely an Islamic state otherwise, or
Israel was at that time?
Oh, because in 47 the Western superpowers just
not 47, 48.
48.
Yep.
Yeah, they just went in and said arbitrarily, okay, here's where the Jews can live, right?
Right. Yeah. It was before that. It was all controlled by different Islamic states. Palestine, actually. By the time that we were separating it, before that, it was all under the very vast Ottoman Empire. Ottoman Empire lasted for a good, probably had to be 1,200 years. That's one reason they didn't care. Is because the Ottomans, the Muslims, they barely ever lost. What ended up stopping them and their spread was actually a naval battle that happened in, I believe, the 1500s. And it was from the Spanish. But the Spanish had their own problem, because actually Islam did not stop in Austria. Islam actually spread over on the west side of the Mediterranean as well, and actually went up into Spain. And that's one reason that the Spanish Inquisition happened, was because they wanted to have a mass deportation of Muslim populations.
Yeah, the Moors completely controlled the Iberian Peninsula for a long time.
Right.
I also speak Spanish, and I know a lot of words in Spanish are directly Arabic.
Yep.
Like their word for maybe is ojalá. And it translates to if it is the will of Allah. And if you speak Spanish, you use that word as maybe still.
Yeah. So that's one reason that Muslims just never talk about the Crusades. And I mean, even now, they barely ever even care to talk about it, because they won all the time. The only times that the Crusaders won was only for like a few months, and the only notable time was when they actually managed to take Jerusalem, but they ended up losing it quickly after they massacred the entire population.
Well, yeah, I believe that was the first Crusades. That was probably their most definite win. And really, what's actually funny, if you actually look at the only real reason why they even won the 2 Crusades that they really won is because they took advantage of Muslims fighting amongst each other. Once Muslims, united, and they were as divided as they were, when they pretty much just massacred Christians every time. So really, you could just say the 2 times that they won were pretty much just a result of them not being a united front against Christians.
Yeah, partially. It's actually interesting because the Ottoman Empire was actually pretty well united when the Crusades started. What actually they really took advantage of was actually because Jerusalem was never a very strategic place to begin with. There's no real strategic reason to have it, and to maintain control of it. They actually liked maintaining control of different cities around Jerusalem, and the reason being is because there's actually more cities. There's cities closer to the Jordan River, and then cities also closer to the Mediterranean and the Dead Sea, which is going to supply where all the trade comes through, and also then the Jordan, one of their sources for fresh water. Jerusalem, on the other hand, is located some 20-30 miles inland of the Jordan. So it wasn't, and it also is centralized around a couple other cities that are actually more strategic. So Jerusalem was never a huge military city. The reason that they actually managed to take it was because it wasn't even that super well defended. But that's also why Islam ended up taking it back, was because it is a poor place to try and defend. And I mean, the people, the Jews figured that one out the hard way when Babylon came over, and the only thing that was keeping the Babylonians out was their really poor walls, and they just literally just made a giant ramp out of dirt and marched over the walls.
So, I mean, I'm okay. If it's okay if I jump in, I'm impressed at the amount of reading that you must have done, Chris, and that's why we're gonna have you on for a history chat, explicitly for history. But one thing I want to quick introduce RC Apologist, as RC Apologist has been patiently waiting, and I want to say,
sorry,
RC
man.
Apologist. No, sorry, it's cool. It's been interesting. RC Apologist, glad you're here. We'd love to hear what you're doing over at your channel.
Well, as far as what I'm doing over there is making content that is to equip Christians to engage in apologetics in today's day and age, and dealing with the culture and dealing with the different various false religions, including atheism, that exists out there.
Gotcha. Well, we're glad you're here. This will be a fun discussion. And I have to say, I'm both in the comments and in this discussion, I'm a little bit surprised. I usually thought most atheists are like, yeah, bro, evolution totally explains why we have the moral feelings we do. And in the comment section as well, I'm seeing that people are, I mean, maybe you're persuading them, Christopher. They're kind of like, oh, okay, maybe it doesn't. I'm not sure anymore. So really interesting. RC Apologist, do you see it as plausible that evolution could explain why we have our perceptions of morality? Because Christopher's been batting it down pretty well this whole night. It's been interesting to hear his ideas. They're new ideas, and it's kind of like, oh, okay, this is a good way to think about it. Really interesting. So what do you think, RC Apologist? I mean, if you're not a believer in evolution and the idea as defined as all living organisms that live today coming from a single-celled organism billions of years ago. Mm-hmm. If you don't believe it, just for the sake of argument, let's say you grant that as having been true, would you say that process, if it did happen, could explain our moral experiences of the world?
Well, I mean, I'm not the one that does the kind of granting of the arguments in certain things, but I do affirm that evolution is just something that happened and God uses it. And while I would say that in this case that would happen, I simply would just point it out that it's simply directly God gives us our moral values. We know what is right and wrong because God has written that upon our hearts, as is mentioned in Romans chapter 2, verses 14 through 15. And so that's where I would say is where we get our moral values and such. Whether you want to get it through saying it's from evolution or any other sort of argument or such, it all eventually goes to God as the ultimate one who gives the moral values.
So you're a divine command theorist?
Say that again.
Are you a divine command theorist then? What God dictates is what is right?
There's been different definitions in which someone has explained divine command theorist different than what that is. So as far as that he's established a law, he is the law creator and the law giver. He is created what is moral. Just like there's the laws of logic.
Right. It's
such.
based off of his whim.
Based off of his knowledge and based off of his authority.
Again, that would make it come down to it's based off of what he wants in the end.
Mm-hmm.
Okay, that's simply what I was asking.
Do we agree that there are other non-human animals that display what we would consider moral behavior, i.e. empathy or reciprocal and non-reciprocal altruism?
Yes.
We can start there, right?
I would agree.
I'm thinking I don't. Oh, go ahead. I don't have the exact. I don't have the actual species of bird, but I was just recently reading about several species of birds, and the dominant, the alpha bird in the brood or the coven or the murder flock, whatever it is, it's a non-reciprocal type of altruism where he sits in the high branches and he's the lookout, and he knows that he's easily, he's up there just waiting to get picked off, and it cannot be reciprocal. He's doing it for the good of the rest of the flock, and it's a position of honor, but there's nothing for him to gain individually from that action.
Okay.
Yeah. So what I was saying. Oh, go ahead.
Oh yeah, empathy is definitely. I definitely do believe that animals do display a sense of it. I mean, like I would say, baboons can be self-sacrificial. They can sacrifice themselves for the good of their pack. And you might see the father defending his children, or like the mother defending her cubs, and like that. And we can always see the evolutionary benefits of doing such a thing. Like, if the mom didn't defend her cubs and just left them there, then that would make them easier to be preyed on by other people or by other animals. So, I mean, I definitely agree that there's there. I would say, though, that empathy can come in many different forms. For a thing is, what we find is, with racism and stuff, it's very easy for us, to become where we feel empathy towards people in our own pack. People that either look like us or share some sort of common idea with us. And it's very easy for us to just completely say, okay, you're not in my pack, therefore, I don't need to have empathy for you. We know that with many animals also have some sort of thing, like a pig would say exhibits some form of empathy, but it's not like the pig is going to get really up and wild if they see you get your throat cut in front of them. They're not going to they're not going to really have that sense. So, I mean, empathy can come in just many different shapes. So I like to preference that. I always like to make sure to note that we also have to be careful when we ascribe behavior to animals to not anthropomorphize them.
Yes.
Because that can be, for example, we tend to really believe that dogs have the same sense of guilt that we do. But in reality, they don't. We have actually done studies with that, and they don't have guilt. At least not in the same way we do. The thing is that they've been raised they've evolved alongside us for so long that they know how to mimic our facial expressions. And they know how to just behave like us, but that doesn't necessarily mean that they have the same emotion, like the cognitive states that we do when it comes to guilt. So, I always preference that, they have empathy, but we have to make sure to just say empathy comes in different degrees, just like how guilt may have come in different degrees.
Right, and empathy even within a species has its limits, because I like that you brought up different ape species, but one I would have brought up in particular was chimps, because they are exceedingly complicated, especially in their societal structures and their view and their societal morality. down to the point that if they find a member that actually is breaking from their societal norm, they will excommunicate or sometimes even kill that member in order to keep a status quo.
I think you're putting yourself in a weaker position by trying to give an explanatory story for how morality could have emerged on an atheistic worldview, particularly if you had some kind of like Darwinian picture.
Well, I mean, it's not even strictly an atheistic worldview. I mean, even if you're the most devout like Christian, you could still admit that, you know, animals exhibit some form of morality. Like, you can say that, you know, they're not like us, they don't have the morality like we do, but you can say it's still make the concession.
Of course, it's going to be more primitive. Go ahead. Go ahead.
I can go after you.
Yes. Okay. What was I saying? Oh, yeah. It's not. You know, a direct correlation. Of course, they're more primitive. Human animals, and to a lesser extent, maybe more advanced mammals. You know, we've got a neocortex that other mammals don't have, and we're way more. That's why, I mean, we're squishy. We don't have fangs. We don't have claws. The only thing that's kept us around this long is our big old brain and our ability to reason. And that was our sole survival quality that we had over all the others.
Well, I mean, I would be prepared to express skepticism about all of those claims, right? And I'd be happy to concede that we don't actually have any good explanation for the emergence of things like human morality, right? But see, I think the thing is that I think it's a mistake for atheists to feel like they need to have an explanation like that in order to, because theists aren't actually able to offer anything more than a just so story to account for those things. Right?
Yeah, but that doesn't mean that we shouldn't try and offer our own justification.
Yeah, if there were one available, right? I'm not sure that anything that anybody here has said amounts to anything more than a just so story. But the point is, even if we had nothing, even if atheists had nothing to offer in terms of an explanatory story, that's nothing to be embarrassed about, because all theists have to offer are just so stories.
I don't think. Well, I don't like that characterization.
But do you think it's false?
Yes, because I think that you'd have to demonstrate that it's false, or that your statement is true. That is just a just so story.
Oh, so you think that there is? You think that there have been theistic explanations that have been offered that don't amount to mere just so stories?
Yeah,
what's an example?
I actually suggest you read, for example, George Berkeley. George Berkeley's argument for the substance and well, basically his argument for reality. It's a form of idealism.
I'm familiar with Berkeley's arguments for subjective idealism.
Then you should also know that they're basically unrefutable.
That's going to be, first of all, that's not going to have anything to do with the science, right? So just so story accusation.
Well, actually, it does have a lot to do with science. If you're trying to argue that science is not directly impacted by what reality is.
No, I'm saying it's a metaphysical thesis. So like you can imagine two people. So like if you take a subjective idealist view, if you take a view like Berkeley's view, which is a subjective idealist view, and then you take say a completely objective view like a materialist view, the science is going to be consistent with both views, right? One person is going to say that this model actually indicates something real and objective, independent of minds, and the other person is going to look at the same model and say this indicates something subjective, merely about our experience. That's all that is put on.
Well, except that in the end, when you talk about science in terms of Berkeley's view, is that science is ultimately meaningless and doesn't actually add anything to it.
No, I don't think that's right.
No, it does, because in Berkeley's view, there are only two things: minds and ideas. Ideas are things that are perceived by minds. Therefore, anything like an animal to a rock to the way that the earth was formed to the way that animals evolved actually is all just an idea perceived by the human mind. It didn't actually happen.
Well, I mean, to say it didn't actually happen is to beg the question against Berkeley's view, oddly enough, right? Because for Berkeley, all actuality is ideas. So to say it didn't actually happen because it's an idea is just to beg the question, oddly, against the view that you're defending.
No, actually, it's not.
Yeah, because that's all it actually is. All animals actually are on that view are ideas, right? That's all.
Exactly. That means that they're actually non-existent. They are They are literally projections of our mind.
Yeah. So that doesn't.
Which means that evolution is a project. That just means that evolution is a projection of our mind, and therefore evolution didn't happen.
You're just contradicting Berkeley's view, right? Berkeley doesn't think that ideas are non-existent, right? In fact, he says to be is to be perceived, right? Esse est percipi, right? To be is to be perceived,
only in the
right?
term, but only in the term of ideas, and you have to note that.
Well,
remember,
but then you're
he also says that without God perceiving everything, the minute that we'd walk out of a room, that room would cease to exist.
Yeah, I don't see the relevance of that.
Yeah, that really
because it means that existence itself is completely dependent on a mind.
Yeah, but the fact that it's dependent on a mind doesn't mean
that it is ultimate.
Doesn't mean that it isn't actual, right? That was what you said, right? That these things are non-existent, they're not actual, right? That's just to contradict Berkeley's view, right?
No, because Berkeley's view is that the only thing that is actual is a mind.
Just a minute. Yeah, and not that the only thing that is actual is a mind, right? Ideas in the mind are also actual, right? He doesn't think ideas are non-existent, right? He doesn't think that they're illusions, right? He thinks they're ideas, right? And ideas are existence, right? With a T, right? So the point is that you can be an actualist about you can be an actualist about all of those things, right? Animals or rocks or anything that's perceived, right? And be a subjective idealist at the same time. You're just saying that those objects don't have a mind-independent reality, right?
Right. So
they're mind-dependent.
Right. So think about it as an ontological relation rather than any sort of scientific relation. So if you were to say that the ontological status of animals is that they're mind dependent, or if someone were to disagree and say the ontological status of animals is that they're material objects existing independent of whether we believe that they exist or not, they're still going to be there, and you can still have predictive expectations regardless of what the ontology of animals is.
Actually, I'd argue that you can't, not without assuming that there's actually something you can predict.
Yeah, you generate predictions based off the contents of the ideas or whatever, even if it's subjective.
But you have to assume that the ideas are actually able to be predicted.
Look, the point is that your mind
nowhere. For example, science only works actually in the context of causality. Nowhere in Berkeley's model is causality actually posited to be a thing.
He was an occasionalist.
This almost sounds like it's devolved into a form of dismissive solipsism. Realities over there.
It's not solipsism is that you can't know anything.
No, well, solipsism is the only thing. Yeah, solipsism is the only thing that you can know is that your mind exists.
You can't know your mind exists. You can't know your mind exists.
That's just a claim. I mean, that's something you have to back.
Okay, prove that you exist to yourself. How would you do that?
I would do that by touching myself in the reality that we have, and furthermore,
You're assuming reality exists. You beg the question.
that's not begging the question if I
It
can
is.
demonstrate it.
No, because
I'm
you
sorry,
beg the
you're
question.
basically dismissing all of reality as a matter of convenience.
It,
And that
in
makes any argument from this point forward basically just
in solipsism, the problem is that in order for us to even assume to say that there's reality, first you have to assume it exists, because you can't prove that reality exists. That's why there are solipsists. Is because you have to prove that things exist.
If you look up the definition of solipsism and go back to some philosophy 101, and I'm not trying to be like derisive here, but it really is just that the only thing that you can know that exists is your mind. The old brain in the vat argument.
Yes, and I would argue that you can't even know that, because in order to do that, you have to assume you exist before you prove you exist.
And you can make that argument, but I'm just saying that that's not what solipsism is.
I know. I'm saying that anyone who is a true hard solipsist can't even prove that they exist.
I'm Ralph Ellis, by the way.
Nice to meet you.
What's up, guys?
Well, if you're a hard solipsist, you believe that the only thing that exists is your mind.
Yes.
I know. I'm asking for a justification for that.
All I was doing was pointing out that your definition of solipsism was incorrect, and I'm trying to show you that if you move in such a way that all of reality merely becomes this grand fiction, then there's almost nothing that we can discuss rationally.
I know, and I'm not of the opinion that that is the case. What I'm pointing out, though, is that science really actually only works with a core set of presuppositions, and it doesn't. And I don't think that it completely would work in Berkeley's world, not without adding on more presuppositions. And we also have and then also we have the thing that Berkeley's worldview actually only works with a God, because it has to have an all-perceiver.
But I'm going to demonstrate to you,
which means that theism is not actually just a bunch of hokum stories. Berkeley is basically irrefutable. I mean, you can ask.
I haven't specifically read Berkeley's work, so I'm not going to comment on that. But I can comment on the nature of what you're saying, and what you're saying again is basically you're just creating a framework with which you can actually dismiss the entirety of reality, based on this idea that it requires a mind. And what that really does is it kind of stands on the grave of everyone who's ever died and reality persists. You know. So I mean, that's just one of those things. If you can't accept that reality is real as a basis of your argument, then there's almost no direction for you to go.
I didn't deny that it was real. I said that I'm not actually an idealist. I am a materialist.
Okay. I was just going to ask if you
I was arguing it because Jack, I think it was said that all theists have is just a bunch of hokum stories. Which I don't think is the case at all, and that's why I was saying you can't bloody refute Berkeley, and Berkeley's entire view works on theism.
It's weird that you said that you're a materialist if you believe that you couldn't refute Berkeley and idealism.
Because I can accept that you can't refute Berkeley. It doesn't mean that I think he's right, though.
Okay, then having the conversation about Berkeley is moot at this point, and that's what I was getting at.
No, it's. The only reason I brought it up was because he was trying to say that all theists have are a bunch of stories and it's hokum, and I think that is just utter
That's
trite.
not the term that I used. I used the term just so story, right, which has a specific meaning. That theistic explanations are ad hoc, right? They're not independently verifiable.
Externally, from what I heard from the get-go, was you. I'm sorry, the other gentleman in the blue shirt. What he originally said was that's a just so story, and then you responded, okay, that's a just so story, and then he tried to turn a just so story into Berkeley's explanation, I guess, of how nothing but the
Well, no, I tried to show that it's not just a just so story, because Berkeley actually has arguments,
but
logical arguments that anyone can use and verify to actually back up his view.
That's not. It's the fact that there's an argument for the view doesn't mean it's not a just so story. Right?
Well, it sure does, because he actually has a method that you can use. He actually has methods you can use.
It's not actually relevant.
Just hold on. To make sure we're not talking past each other. What do you think a just so story is?
Me?
Yeah, Christopher. Yeah.
Well, whenever I hear people just say all they have is a just so story. I mean, all he just said it was all they have are ad hoc stories is what he actually ended up defining it as. I think that's just complete nonsense and an absolutely just a complete generalization.
Well, I'm asking for an analysis of what an ad hoc explanation or a just so story. I'm asking if you understand that concept.
Yes, I understand what ad hoc is.
All right, so explain it to me.
Ad hoc is basically a particular argument or a particular formed thing for purpose only.
It's an extension of an argument.
Yeah, so
for purpose only.
The idea is like when you construct an explanation, just to explain the certain state of affairs. Like whatever the state of affairs is, you construct the explanation just to explain that. So you can imagine that there are competing explanations for, let's say, the sun rising, right? Like, and one explanation is that it's carried across the sky by a chariot, and another explanation is that it's really far away and the Earth rotates, and then we see it appears to rise because it's really far away and the Earth is actually just rotating, right? So like those are two competing explanations. But until there's further evidence, all we have is just that story, right? And so the point of calling it a just so story is that, yeah, if it were true, it would explain what we observe, right? But the point is that there's no reason to believe it just because it can account for what we observe. So that's why it's called a just so story.
And what I'm, yes, and I know that, and that is what I said when I said ad hoc. It is an argument, or well, extension of an argument for purpose only.
Yeah, I don't think anybody's trying to browbeat you, man. We're just trying to understand where you're coming from, and because the idea here, real quick, if you don't mind, this is what I came into after watching the video was you guys were, I guess, having a discussion of whether morality can actually, emerge from evolution, right? Originally, and I guess the idea was, maybe I'm missing part of this conversation, but the thing is you know what? Just go ahead, man, because I'm kind of flustered now.
Yeah, let's go back to the morality thing because
morality is kind of my bread and butter, man. I'd love to.
Yeah, we're grossly off topic right now.
So what Jack was saying was he was saying that all theists have to explain the appearance of morality is just some sort of some story that gives you exactly what you want, but there's no actual entailments from that, such that we can generate new predictions and actually have evidence for the truth of those propositions. And so Jack, I know Jack, so he thinks that the same thing is true for most of the atheistic morality stories, right? I mean, we could go into more detailed analysis about why that would be true and why they're just so stories. But when he was making that criticism, he was saying we don't need to do all that because there's a much stronger criticism of theistic beliefs, such that if they offer some story, they're going to have to give some sort of independent justification to believe that story. Because it's like, sure, if it's true, that would explain why we have the moral beliefs that we have. Fine, right? We can grant that for the sake of argument. But what reason do we have to believe that story? What reason do we have to believe that explanation?
Okay. Yeah, I remember that. Okay. I mean, I'm down for talking about anything. I mean, I'm the guest here, man. I want to be cool and everything, abide by your guys' rules. But the show's about morality, and I've got a lot of study into the topic. Like I said in chat, I refer to myself as a relativistically moral particularist. If any of you guys are actually familiar with those terms.
Hey, buddy.
Yeah.
No, I'm just saying, hey, as a fellow traveler.
Oh, okay. Right on, man. So one of the big problems with theism, as I see it, emerging 23 years plus as a Presbyterian and then a fundamental Baptist, is, of course, the claim of moral objectivity, whereas I would define morality as a framework that allows us to arrive at the optimal solution for what we perceive to be right, wrong, good, or evil. And I append this whole process, this model, to be it's an anthropological emergence. As we've evolved, our cognition has adapted. We've obviously been able to abstractly consider moral conundrums of a far greater scope than the previous monkeys and dogs that you guys were discussing earlier. So what I'd really kind of like to do is just kind of open myself up, I guess, as a theist come atheist. That's pretty much it, and answer or address any questions you guys have about morality. I know I'm kind of out of left field here or whatever, but I promise you it'll be informing.
Well, I'm glad that you're saying that, because I do have a question that we've been going after the whole night. And so are you familiar with Sharon Street's evolutionary debunking argument of basically objective morality?
I am not.
Okay, so it's like a pretty simple idea. Basically, as you mentioned, most theists believe in fact, almost all theists believe in objective morality. And so they might use the moral argument. And a lot of atheists, is actually an argument that's relevant for atheists who believe in objective morality, that if you happen to believe in objective morality, you have this problem, both the theist and atheist potentially. If you grant that evolution is just a natural process that can, now there's a careful distinction we have to make here. I don't mean to talk about evolution as being able to explain the causes of our behaviors, but more precisely as can evolution explain why we have these moral senses about certain behaviors? So, for example, such as like killing being wrong. And so I had been talking with Christopher where I said, hey, basically Sharon Street's argument is that if evolution can explain why we have these, namely, so for example, this is something Christopher disagrees on, and he's actually given a good case for it tonight, so we can hear him out. But Sharon Street made a good point that if evolution can explain why I, let's say, have feelings of like, yeah, murder is bad, suicide is bad, and stealing is bad, because if I had not had that feeling, I would be more likely to do those behaviors. But of course, that would actually make it less likely for me to pass on my genes, because if I kill somebody, if I murder somebody, I'm probably, maybe especially in tribal days, I would get murdered in return. Or if I steal somebody's stuff, I might even get murdered. So the idea is, it may be the case that those who sensed that those behaviors were wrong were the ones that happen to pass on their genes. But you wouldn't have to explain that as being the result of there being objective morality out there. You could just say, well, hey, maybe it's just that evolution, just the reason you have these feelings is explained by the fact that had you not had them, you never would have passed on your genes. So that, you could say, undermines the case for why we have these feelings as being legitimate evidence of there actually being objective morality out there. Because you might say, oh, okay, well, it's not that I'm really picking up on something when I have this moral experience of murder being wrong. I'm not picking up on some sort of objective truth out there. It's just explained by my evolutionary history. Does that make sense?
Yeah, it does make sense. But the thing is I mean, what you're explaining, is she for an evolutionary explanation for morality?
Yes, definitely.
Is that what I'm getting? Yeah, okay. So everything that you've actually told me regarding what she says, I mean, it makes sense. The problem here is usually one of scope, of time, and sociological development. I don't think anybody here could really argue that in most cases, society across the globe has developed a more moral sense overall. If we were alive back in, the Roman period, or before that, the Greeks, there were laws that were simply heinous that today we couldn't even, most people wouldn't even conceive of as they pull up to Starbucks to get their latte. It's just not in the forefront of their mind, but it was a normal thing for them back then. So one of the big problems with objectivity when it's applied to morality is, of course, that it kind of commits a fatalism consistently, persistently. I don't know if you've heard this before.
Wait, what would it have to do with fatalism? I don't know.
Okay. I know you're probably thinking of fatalism like as in terms of like theological fatalism. That's not what I'm discussing here. What I'm talking about is moral fatalism, and only when it comes to the term of or the description of objective morality. Okay, morality is a framework. All right, it's something that we've developed and refined over generations, eons of our sociological development. And I do think there's kind of like a nature nurture thing going on there that forms it. Some of it we get from the nature side. A lot of it is reinforced via nurture.
Sorry to interrupt. Will you just do me a favor and just explain what you think moral fatalism is? Because I've never.
Yeah, absolutely. Okay, so the problem with an objective claim is that when you make the objective claim, if you can demonstrate any period or circumstance or context in which that claim can be rendered permissible, then it's no longer objective. And I can't.
What is fatalism? I just want to know what moral fatalism is.
Okay, that's what I just defined. Moral fatalism, it's objective moral fatalism is what I've referred to it as. But essentially, what it is that there is no objective moral claim that you can make that can stand moral scrutiny given a certain context. Do you understand what I'm saying there?
You're saying that for every posited moral claim, there's
for every objective moral claim.
Yeah, for every positive objective moral claim, there's some context such that moral proposition is false. Is that the idea?
Or permissible. Correct. Yes. You hit it on the nose. And I'd be willing to play that game all night too. Like if somebody wants to think of, I mean, right down to, eating children. I mean, whatever. We can discuss whatever. I'm open to.
It's one I've been actually playing at because we were talking about murder and how and how can you really define murder, because it's completely subjective based on society, and then what things that we would consider murder. So in our society, it'd be unlawful to, sacrifice your children to Baal. But if you were in ancient Carthage, that was a normal thing.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah.
Well, if someone just gave moral prescriptions, that's not inconsistent, right? As long as they're consistent, you're just saying that. I mean, it seems your objection to say that objective morality commits one to objective fatalism or whatever, as you've defined it.
Right.
That just seems like you're begging the question against the view.
Well, that's why I offered to demonstrate it, because I don't think it's fair to simply claim that it exists without demonstrating it. So for us to be able to do that, you would have to give me a moral proposition.
It's wrong to kill.
Okay. It's not always wrong to kill.
Well, that's just the antithesis of the claim. That's
okay. I agree. Except we can demonstrate it in reality. If someone comes at you and they wish to do you harm, like say rape your child, bash your child's brains in or something like that, then logically it follows that you're allowed to effect whatever defense is necessary, up to it including killing them, in order to stop them.
No, I don't think that follows.
No.
So
well, then you have a dead child, and that's what you're left with.
Yeah, but
it's a consequences in reality.
In which case you have by in effect of not doing anything, let that child die, and so in effect could be associated with the killing.
Even if it were the case that your child died, it doesn't show that it's permissible to murder somebody. If it's objectively morally wrong, then it's impermissible to kill that person regardless of whether you do it.
This is going to be one of those things. I'm sorry, go ahead.
But if it's objectively morally wrong, then why is it that we can legally get away with defending ourselves?
Well, that's not a moral thing.
Well, sure, because if you can say that if you're going to say that objective morality exists, and you can't demonstrate that it exists, and I can show you every subjective case in the world where it seems to be contradictory, then there is no case for objective morality at all. I have a stronger case for subjective morality than you would ever have for objective morality if I can show that it is inconsistent throughout different societies.
Interestingly, I think we're on the same page here.
I don't think that doesn't follow, right? So like even if it were the case that people just like, say for example, there's one set of moral propositions that are true. There's a true set of moral propositions. They're true independently of whether anybody thinks they're true, but other people don't behave accordingly with those moral propositions. It doesn't show that just because people are behaving discordantly with those moral propositions that they're false. It might be that every single society on Earth behaves discordantly with those moral propositions, but that doesn't show that they're not objective. It also doesn't show that they're false, right? So that,
but it shows that you can't. But it shows that we won't know what they are if everyone acts discordantly.
I mean, sure, it could show that
in which case, there's no point in even positing the hypothetical if we can't know what it is.
Yeah, the problem with your position is if you're saying if everybody is acting discordantly with whatever this divine command theory or moral objective command is, you know, the fact is that there's positive outcomes in reality that counter that. There are instances in realities, like say a law enforcement officer, a soldier, where an obligation to kill, okay, is a reality, and it's to stop somebody from doing potentially a greater harm.
Well, like if you were to say that there are hypothetical reasons to do things, I don't think that has any bearing on the metaphysical claim of objective morality, because like you might agree, like most proponents of objective morality will agree with you that there are hypothetical reasons to engage in actions, right? They're just saying that sometimes those hypothetical reasons contradict the categorical moral reasons to do them.
Okay, but then all you're doing is essentially saying no, that's still objective as actual.
No, I'm not doing that. All I'm doing is criticizing your criticism. So I'm not actually.
The problem you have though is that if you're going to say that objective morals exist regardless of people following them, if there's a bunch of people disagreeing about what, let's say killing is always wrong, okay, and everyone disagrees in some instance that killing is always wrong, how will we ever come to the conclusion and know for a fact that killing is always wrong?
Look,
well, I'm challenging your epistemology because I don't know how you can come to the conclusion that there is any objective moral fact.
Look, the only point of my criticism, first of all, I'm not defending moral realism. I think you guys are both mistaken in thinking that I'm proffering the view of moral realism.
I know you're just doing it from a hypothetical point of view.
No, but I'm not even doing it hypothetically. I'm just saying, like, look, even if I agreed with you that there's an epistemological problem, which I do think that there's a problem for moral epistemology, but even if I agree with that moral epistemology, there's an issue of moral epistemology, that doesn't show that there couldn't be objective morality, right? That shows that at best, if there is objective morality, we can't know what the moral propositions are. And with respect to what Ralph said, I was just pointing out that I think that all he's showing is that there are sometimes that hypothetical reasons conflict with objective reasons, but that doesn't show that the reasons aren't objective.
Okay, but objective means true in all cases, and if you can have a single black swan, then it's not true in all cases. You've negated the claim that it's objective, and that's what I'm getting at.
Well, no, I'm saying that you might be confused. Say it's true. The proposition is true that it's wrong to kill somebody, and someone in some state of confusion believes that it's okay to kill somebody. They might be wrong, right? That proposition might be false. They might believe that it's moral to kill someone. They might kill someone anyway, but that could still be false, irrespective of whether they believe it.
Yeah, but now you're just kind of delving into.
But I mean, at that point,
anything goes.
I mean, yeah, I mean, at that point, what is the point of even talking about something that you can't even establish any baseline for knowing?
I'm just suggesting that Ralph is begging the question. I'm not talking about.
We're not saying that. At least I'm not saying that objective morality cannot exist. I'm saying that there's no good reason for even acknowledging it.
Using an epistemological approach to morality, all right, which I realize that most objective moralists they just don't. You know, it's kind of their presuppositional position. But if you take any sort of epistemological approach towards morality, where you're trying to understand the nature of what is good and what is wrong, what is evil, you know, basically you can come to the conclusion that there are factually times due to the nature of our existence where you have to kill. And that's a demonstration in reality. And I just don't think it gets any better than that.
Well, you're confusing moral metaphysics with moral epistemology, right?
Yeah, I do think that you are conflating the metaphysics. Well, not I wouldn't say moral. Meta ethics is more, I would say, is what he's conflating.
Well, but, the problem here is I'm demonstrating to you guys, and this is a problem that you get with a lot of theists, is the simple fact that you cannot finitely claim that something is purely objectively true, and then show a contextual, accession to it. You just can't do that.
But to say that there are contextual exceptions is to beg the question. What you're doing when you say that there exist such exceptions is you're begging the question. Because, like, look, we can countenance this by saying either it's the case that people believe that there are exceptions, in which case, if there's objective morality, those people are just wrong. They're just wrong, full stop, irrespective of whether they believe it. I mean, think about it this way. Like, look, say, for example, that there are no black swans, hypothetically, right? If that's true, if there are no black swans, and someone believes that there's a black swan, that person is just wrong. Right? Likewise with morality, if there's never a justified killing of another human being, and someone believes, given some context, that there's a justified killing of a human being, if the morality is objective, that person is just wrong, irrespective of whether they believe it.
Yeah, I agree with you there. The problem, but again, my issue is always going to come down to the epistemology.
It's a demonstration in reality. I feel like you're living over here, and I appreciate like the hypothetical analysis, and I like the the counter talk, but the reality is when we use morality to determine the right and wrong of a thing, we go through a process.
Yeah, but I mean, when you say that, you're begging the question, and
I'm not, because it's how everybody works. Everybody.
Even if it were the case that that's how everybody works, it still begs the question.
No, it demonstrates that that's the way that morality works.
It does beg the question, because we're not talking about how morality works. We're talking about defining morality. We're talking about the definitions that we're working with. And if you're going to say that objective morality has exceptions, then it automatically is not objective. And so all you've done is just conflated. You have actually committed a false equivocation.
Well, it's not an equivocation. He's just claiming the antithesis of the view, which is begging the question, right? Like, you're just claiming. Okay.
I'm so sorry to interrupt, but I have to go. This is like an hour later than I planned on, but I promise it was worth it.
I wish I was on earlier.
I totally enjoyed this conversation. Well, you guys definitely we'll be in contact through email, or shoot me your email if I don't already have it, or just send a tweet out. And I would love to have you all back on. So I hate to cut it short. But like I said, it's been well worth staying an extra hour. I thank you guys for being on here.
Yeah, thanks for having us. This has been a great conversation, guys, and I hope you didn't.
Because I can't see.
Hope I didn't offend anyone, because I know I got a little tiny heated there. But
modern day hysteria. Okay, let's see.
Yeah, no problem, Christopher. I thought it was great. I thought you guys were frank, like philosophers are, and you were at the same time respectful. And so, it's all safe here. Philosophy people have that gift of being able to totally disagree and then just shake it off and be like, well, we're not gonna hold anything grudges over it. So,
yep.
yeah.
Absolutely.
Well, thank you. So for those of you who are out there and still watching, thank you for tuning in, and feel free to hit that subscribe button for more chats in the future. Very excited to have these guys back on again. And thanks for tuning in. Keep sifting out the reasonable from the unreasonable. Have a good night.
Right on. Have a good night,
Thank you guys.
Bye.